The morning I decided to fill in my backyard swimming pool, I thought I was making the smartest decision of my life. Little did I know, I was about to unleash a neighborhood war that would consume the next 6 months of my existence and turn my quiet suburban street into a battlefield of petty grievances and property disputes. It all started 3 years ago when I inherited my grandmother's house on Maple Street, a charming 1960s ranch-style home with a kidney-shaped pool that had seen better decades. The pool was my grandmother's pride and joy back in the day, the centerpiece of countless summer barbecues and family gatherings. But by the time it came into my possession, it had become more of a liability than an asset. The concrete was cracking. The filtration system was older than some of my coworkers, and the maintenance costs were eating through my budget faster than I could earn it. Every month brought a new expensive surprise. First, it was the pump that decided to give up the ghost in the middle of July, leaving me with a stagnant green lagoon that attracted mosquitoes and the disapproving stares of my neighbors. Then came the heater repair, a whopping $1,200 to fix a system that barely worked anyway. The final straw was when the pool liner developed a massive tear that would cost nearly $8,000 to replace properly. I'm a single dad working as a high school history teacher, and my budget doesn't exactly have room for luxury pool maintenance. My 8-year-old daughter Emma and I had been struggling to keep up with the house payments as it was, and the pool had become this beautiful but expensive albatross around my neck. Emma loved the idea of having a pool, of course, but the reality was that we used it maybe 10 times the entire previous summer. The water was always too cold, too dirty, or I was too exhausted from work to deal with the constant chemical balancing and cleaning. So after months of deliberation and several sleepless nights running numbers on my calculator, I made the decision. The pool had to go. I researched the process extensively. It wasn't just a matter of dumping dirt into a hole. There were permits to obtain, proper drainage considerations, soil compaction requirements, and environmental regulations to follow. I did everything by the book, spending weeks getting the necessary approvals from the city planning department. The process was more involved than I had anticipated. First came the pool draining, which took 2 full days and required coordination with the city's water department to ensure proper disposal. Then came the careful removal of the pool equipment, pumps, filters, lighting, and all the plumbing that snaked around my backyard like some kind of aquatic nervous system. The demolition crew arrived on a Tuesday morning in early April, their jackhammers and heavy machinery making short work of what had once been my grandmother's oasis. I won't lie, there was something deeply satisfying about watching that money pit disappear chunk by chunk. Each piece of broken concrete that went into the dumpster felt like a financial burden lifting off my shoulders. The crew worked efficiently, carefully breaking down the pool structure while preserving the integrity of my surrounding landscaping as much as possible. The filling process took another week. Load after load of clean, filled dirt arrived, each truckload, bringing me closer to financial freedom and a usable backyard space. I had grand plans for the area, maybe a vegetable garden, definitely a play area for Emma, perhaps even a small shed for storage. The possibilities seemed endless as I watched the last traces of my pool disappear under layers of rich, dark soil. Emma was surprisingly okay with the whole thing once I explained that we could use the money we'd saved to finally take that trip to Disney World we'd been talking about for years. She helped me plant grass seed over the newly filled area, and we spent a wonderful Saturday afternoon planning what our new backyard would look like. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe again. The neighborhood response was mostly positive, or at least neutral. Mrs. Rodriguez from next door mentioned that she thought it was a smart financial decision. The Johnsons across the street offered to let Emma use their pool any time during the summer. Even old Mr. Peterson, who complained about everything from lawn heights to garbage can placement, grudgingly admitted that the construction noise hadn't been too disruptive. But there was one neighbor who had been suspiciously quiet throughout the entire process. Karen Mitchell from the house directly behind mine. Karen was what you might charitably call a neighborhood watchdog, though less charitable. Folks had other names for her particular brand of civic involvement. She was the self-appointed guardian of property values, the unofficial enforcer of homeowners association rules we didn't actually have, and the kind of person who measured her neighbor's grass with a ruler to ensure it met her personal standards. Karen had lived on Elm Street for 15 years, and her backyard faced mine across a small creek that ran between our properties. Her house was immaculate, the kind of place that looked like it belonged in a home and garden magazine, with perfectly manicured lawns, symmetrical flower beds, and outdoor furniture that was somehow always clean despite being outside. She took enormous pride in her backyard oasis, complete with a deck, hot tub, and elaborate landscaping that she spent every evening maintaining with almost obsessive precision. During the pool removal process, I had noticed Karen watching from her back deck more frequently than usual. She would stand there with her morning coffee, arms crossed, staring at the construction activity with an expression I couldn't quite read. I had waved a few times, trying to be neighborly, but she never waved back. I figured she was just curious about the process, or maybe annoyed by the temporary disruption to the neighborhood's tranquility. What I didn't realize was that Karen had been nursing a growing obsession with my pool situation that went far beyond normal neighborly interest. Unbeknownst to me, she had been taking photographs of the construction process, documenting every truck that came and went, every piece of equipment that crossed my property line. She had been making phone calls to the city, demanding to know if proper permits had been obtained. She had even started a notebook, a detailed log of what she perceived as violations, disruptions, and potential property value impacts. The first sign of trouble came exactly 2 weeks after the construction was completed. I was in my kitchen making dinner when I heard a sharp knock at my front door. Not the friendly tap of a neighbor stopping by to chat, but the aggressive rap of someone with a mission. When I opened the door, there stood Karen Mitchell, clutching a manila folder and wearing an expression that could have curdled milk. "We need to talk," she announced, pushing past me into my living room without invitation. Emma was at her friend's house for a sleepover, so at least she wasn't there to witness what was about to unfold. Karen spread out the contents of her folder on my coffee table like a prosecutor presenting evidence. Photographs, printouts, official-looking. Documents and pages of handwritten notes covered every inch of available surface. It was then that I realized just how deep her obsession had gone. "Do you have any idea what you've done to our neighborhood?" she demanded, her voice rising with each word. "This was a prestigious area, a place where people took pride in their properties, and now you've destroyed one of the most valuable features on the entire street." I tried to remain calm, explaining that the pool had been a financial burden I couldn't afford, that I had followed all proper procedures, that it was my property to do with as I saw fit. But Karen wasn't interested in reasonable conversation. She had worked herself into a righteous fury, and nothing I said was going to derail her from the speech she had clearly been practicing. "That pool was visible from 6 different houses," she continued, waving her arms dramatically. "It was part of the neighborhood's character, part of what made this area special. And you just destroyed it for your own selfish convenience." The argument continued for nearly an hour, with Karen becoming increasingly agitated and me becoming increasingly confused about what exactly she expected me to do. The pool was gone, the permits had been properly obtained, the work had been completed according to code. There was literally nothing left to discuss, but Karen seemed determined to relitigate every aspect of my decision. Finally, she gathered up her papers with theatrical indignation and headed for the door. But before leaving, she turned back with a look that should have warned me about what was coming. "This isn't over," she declared. "You may think you can just do whatever you want without considering the impact on your neighbors, but you're wrong. Dead wrong." As I watched her storm across my front yard and disappear into the evening shadows, I had no idea that her threat wasn't just empty posturing. Karen Mitchell was about to launch a campaign of harassment that would make my pool removal look like a minor inconvenience by comparison. The first sign that Karen's threat wasn't just hot air came exactly 48 hours later, on a peaceful Thursday morning that I'll never forget. I was getting ready for work, packing Emma's lunch and trying to locate her missing math homework, when I heard the unmistakable sound of multiple car doors slamming in my driveway. Through my kitchen window, I could see 2 patrol cars parked behind my Honda Civic, their presence immediately filling me with the kind of dread that only comes when you know you're about to be dragged into something completely beyond your control. The doorbell rang 3 times in rapid succession, the aggressive ring of someone who wasn't going to be ignored. When I opened the door, I found myself face to face with 2 police officers who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else in the world. Behind them, standing on my front sidewalk with her arms crossed and a satisfied smirk on her face, was Karen Mitchell. "Mr. Davidson?" the older officer asked, consulting a small notebook. "We're here about a complaint regarding unpermitted construction and potential environmental violations on your property." My heart sank into my stomach. I invited the officers inside while Karen remained on the sidewalk, clearly relishing her role as the neighborhood's self-appointed law enforcement liaison. What followed was one of the most surreal conversations of my life, as I found myself explaining to 2 bemused police officers why I had legally removed a pool from my own backyard. Officer Martinez, the younger of the 2, seemed genuinely confused about why they'd been called. "Sir, do you have the permits for the pool removal?" he asked, and I was able to produce the entire folder of documentation I'd kept meticulously organized throughout the process. Building permits, environmental clearances, city inspection reports, everything was in order and had been from day 1. Meanwhile, through my front window, I could see Karen pacing back and forth on the sidewalk, occasionally gesturing dramatically toward my backyard as if she were describing a crime scene. She had clearly expected this interaction to go very differently, and the growing realization that the police weren't going to arrest me on the spot was not sitting well with her master plan. "Ma'am," Officer Rodriguez, the senior officer, finally called out to Karen, "everything appears to be in order here. The homeowner has all the proper documentation, and we can't find any violations." That's when Karen's carefully constructed facade of concerned citizenship began to crack. "But what about the environmental impact?" she shrieked, her voice carrying across the entire neighborhood. "What about the runoff? What about the impact on property values? What about the disruption to the natural drainage patterns?" The officers exchanged a look that clearly said they'd encountered this type of situation before. Officer Martinez gently explained to Karen that environmental concerns were handled by the city's planning department during the permit process, that property values weren't a police matter, and that drainage issues would fall under the jurisdiction of the Public Works Department if they actually existed. But Karen wasn't finished. As the officers prepared to leave, she pulled out her phone and began scrolling through what appeared to be dozens of photos. "What about this?" she demanded, shoving the phone toward Officer Rodriguez. "This truck was parked illegally. And this construction equipment was blocking the sidewalk. And look at this. They were working before 7 a.m., which violates the noise ordinance." I watched in growing amazement as Karen presented her case with the thoroughness of a prosecutor seeking the death penalty. She had photographed every construction vehicle, documented the arrival and departure times of every worker, and even recorded decibel readings of the construction noise using some kind of app on her phone. The woman had turned my pool removal into a full-scale surveillance operation. The officers were professional, but clearly losing patience. They explained that construction vehicles are allowed to park on public streets during permitted work hours, that the equipment she'd photographed was entirely on my property, and that the noise ordinance didn't apply to permitted construction activities during business hours. Every single one of her complaints was either legally baseless or factually incorrect. That's when Karen played what she clearly thought was her trump card. "Fine," she said, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "But what about the impact on my property? That pool was part of my view. It was part of what I paid for when I bought my house. He can't just destroy something that affects my enjoyment of my own backyard." The silence that followed was deafening. Even Emma, who had been watching the entire spectacle from the living room window, seemed to understand that Karen had just said something spectacularly stupid. Officer Martinez actually had to turn away to hide what I'm pretty sure was either laughter or the urge to roll his eyes so hard they'd fall out of his head. "Ma'am," Officer Rodriguez said with the patient tone of someone explaining basic concepts, "to a small child, Your neighbor has the right to do whatever he wants with his own property, as long as it's legal and properly permitted. You don't have any legal right to dictate what he does in his own backyard, regardless of how it affects your view. Karen's face went through a spectrum of colors that would have made a chameleon jealous. Red with anger, white with shock, and finally settling on a mottled purple that suggested she was about to either explode or spontaneously combust. "This is ridiculous," she sputtered. "This is America! I have rights! I pay taxes! I vote!" The officers had clearly reached the end of their patience. They politely but firmly explained to Karen that filing false police reports could result in charges being filed against her, and that she needed to stop harassing her neighbors over legal property improvements. They suggested she contact a lawyer if she truly believed her rights had been violated, but warned her that continuing to call the police over non-existent violations would not end well for her. As the patrol cars finally pulled away, I thought the worst was over. I was wrong. Dead wrong. The Real Karen campaign began that very afternoon. I came home from work to find a certified letter in my mailbox, the first of what would become a weekly occurrence. Inside was a formal complaint filed with the city's Code Enforcement Department, alleging everything from improper soil compaction to potential groundwater contamination. The letter was 3 pages long and cited municipal codes I'd never heard of, environmental regulations that didn't apply to residential properties, and building standards that seemed to have been copied from some other city entirely. But that was just the beginning. Over the next 2 weeks, I received complaints filed with the Health Department, the Environmental Protection Agency, the Homeowners Insurance Fraud Hotline, and even the Better Business Bureau. Karen had apparently spent considerable time researching every possible agency that might have even the remotest jurisdiction over my property, and she was systematically filing complaints with all of them. Each complaint required me to respond, to provide documentation, to sometimes take time off work to meet with investigators who were clearly just going through the motions to satisfy someone's complaint. The city inspector who came out to examine my backyard actually apologized for wasting my time. "We get these kinds of complaints sometimes," he explained, "usually from neighbors who have some kind of personal issue with each other. Your work was done properly and everything's up to code." But the complaints were just the opening salvo in Karen's war of attrition. Next came the social media campaign. Karen had apparently joined every neighborhood Facebook group, community forum, and local social media platform she could find, and she was using them to wage a propaganda campaign against my pool removal. That would have impressed a political operative. Her posts were masterpieces of passive-aggressive manipulation. She never mentioned me by name, but she didn't need to. Everyone knew exactly which house she was talking about when she wrote long, emotional screeds about neighbors who don't care about community standards and property owners who make selfish decisions that affect everyone. She posted before and after photos of my backyard, lamenting the loss of the beautiful water feature that enhanced our entire neighborhood. She shared articles about property values and pool installations, always with comments about how some people just don't understand the importance of maintaining neighborhood character. The most infuriating part was how she positioned herself as the victim in all of this. According to Karen's version of events, I was some kind of property-destroying monster who had thoughtlessly eliminated a beloved neighborhood landmark without considering the feelings of my poor, suffering neighbors. She painted herself as a concerned citizen trying to protect community values against the selfish actions of an inconsiderate homeowner. But Karen's masterstroke came when she discovered that my grandmother's pool had been featured in a local newspaper article back in 1987 as part of a story about backyard entertaining trends. She somehow obtained a copy of this 37-year-old article and began sharing it everywhere, claiming that I had destroyed a piece of neighborhood history. The headline of her Facebook post still makes my blood boil. "Local teacher destroys. Historic neighborhood pool despite community opposition." Historic, as if my grandmother's kidney-shaped pool was some kind of architectural landmark instead of a concrete hole that had been BO. The answer to Emma's question came in the form of another certified letter that arrived on Monday morning, but this one was different from all the others. Instead of a government agency letterhead, this envelope bore the logo of Mitchell & Associates, Legal Consulting, and was thick enough to contain what felt like a small novel. My hands actually trembled as I opened it, though whether from anger or anxiety, I couldn't tell. Inside was a 23-page legal document that took my breath away. Karen hadn't just been measuring my yard for fun. She had been preparing what she claimed was a property survey dispute. According to her meticulously crafted argument, my pool removal had somehow violated an implied easement that gave her legal rights to the visual amenities of my backyard. She was suing me for property damage, emotional distress, and loss of property value to the tune of $47,000. But that wasn't the shocking part. The shocking part was the letterhead itself. Mitchell and Associates Legal Consulting wasn't some law firm Karen had hired. It was Karen. Karen Mitchell, it turned out, wasn't just a nosy neighbor with too much time on her hands. She was a former paralegal who had been running a small legal consulting business out of her home for the past 8 years, specializing in property disputes and neighbor conflicts. Suddenly, everything made sense. The obsessive documentation, the knowledge of obscure municipal codes, the systematic filing of complaints with every possible agency. This wasn't the desperate flailing of an unhinged neighbor. This was the calculated campaign of someone who knew exactly how to weaponize the legal system against people who couldn't afford to fight back. I spent the rest of that day researching Karen's background, and what I discovered made my blood run cold. Over the past 5 years, she had filed similar lawsuits against 3 other neighbors on various streets around town. A couple who had installed a fence she deemed too tall. A family who had painted their house a color she considered inappropriate for the neighborhood character. An elderly man who had replaced his front lawn with a drought-resistant garden. In each case, she had used her legal knowledge to drag her neighbors through months of expensive litigation, filing motion after motion, demanding discovery, taking depositions, and generally making their lives miserable until they either gave in to her demands or spent thousands of dollars they couldn't afford on legal fees just to make her go away. The most disturbing part was that she had won 2 of the 3 cases, not because she was legally right, but because her opponents couldn't afford to keep fighting. The fence came down, the house got repainted. Only the elderly man with the drought-resistant garden had managed to outlast her, and even then, it had cost him nearly $15,000 in legal fees and taken 2 years of his life. I was staring at the lawsuit papers, trying to figure out how I was going to afford a lawyer on a teacher's salary when my phone rang. It was Mrs. Rodriguez from next door, and she sounded upset. "Daniel," she said, "I think you need to know something about your neighbor. My husband Carlos works for the city planning department, and he told me something today that I think you should hear." What Carlos had discovered was that Karen had been filing complaints about various neighbors for years, but recently, her activities had escalated beyond normal dispute resolution. She had been requesting copies of building permits, property surveys, and tax assessments for every house within a 3-block radius. She had been attending city council meetings and filing formal objections to minor variances and routine permit applications that had nothing to do with her property. But the most disturbing revelation was that Karen had recently applied for a position on the city's planning commission, a volunteer role that would give her official authority over building permits and property disputes. According to Carlos, her application package included a detailed presentation about maintaining neighborhood standards and protecting property values from inconsiderate homeowners. Karen wasn't just harassing her neighbors for fun. She was systematically working to gain official power over other people's property decisions, and my pool removal had apparently been her test case to demonstrate her commitment to community standards. That evening, I sat Emma down for a serious conversation. At 8 years old, she was too young to understand the legal complexities of what was happening, but she was old enough to understand that Mrs. Mitchell was trying to cause problems for our family, and that we might need to make some difficult decisions about our future. "Are we going to have to move, Daddy?" she asked, her big brown eyes filled with worry. The question broke my heart because I honestly didn't know the answer. Fighting Karen's lawsuit would cost money I didn't have and time I couldn't spare. But giving in to her demands would mean, what exactly? Rebuilding a pool I couldn't afford? Paying her money for imaginary damages? Setting a precedent that would encourage her to target other neighbors with similar harassment campaigns? That's when I made a decision that would change everything. Instead of hiring a lawyer I couldn't afford or giving in to Karen's demands, I decided to fight fire with fire. If Karen wanted to play legal games, I would learn the rules and play them better than she did. I spent the next 2 weeks researching everything I could about property law, nuisance suits, and harassment. I filed a formal complaint against Karen with the State Bar Association, detailing her pattern of using legal threats to harass neighbors. I contacted the other victims of her previous lawsuits and convinced 2 of them to file supporting statements about her pattern of behavior. But my masterstroke came when I discovered that Karen's legal consulting business wasn't properly licensed according to state regulations. She had been providing legal advice and drafting legal documents without the proper certifications, which was a violation of state law that could result in both civil and criminal penalties. I filed a complaint with the State Attorney General's office, providing detailed documentation of Karen's unlicensed practice of law, including copies of the legal documents she had filed in her previous neighbor disputes. I also filed a complaint with the Better Business Bureau about her fraudulent business practices and sent a formal notice to the City Planning Commission about her application, including evidence of her history of harassing neighbors. The response was swift and decisive. Within a week, Karen received a cease and desist order from the State Attorney General's office, ordering her to stop providing legal services without proper licensing. Her application to the Planning Commission was rejected. The Better Business Bureau opened an investigation into her business practices, but the real turning point came when I decided to go public with Karen's pattern of harassment. I created a detailed timeline of her campaign against me, including copies of all her complaints, her social media posts, and documentation of her previous lawsuits against other neighbors. I presented this information at the next city council meeting during the public comment period, not as an attack on Karen personally, but as a warning about how the system was being abused by people who knew how to manipulate it. The story was picked up by the local newspaper, and then by a regional TV station that had been running a series about frivolous lawsuits and neighbor disputes. Suddenly, Karen found herself in the spotlight, but not in the way she had intended. Instead of being portrayed as a concerned citizen protecting neighborhood values, she was exposed as a serial litigant who had been using her legal knowledge to bully her neighbors into submission. The public attention had an immediate effect. Karen's lawsuit against me was quietly withdrawn. The various complaints she had filed with city agencies were dropped. Her social media posts about neighborhood standards suddenly stopped appearing. But the most satisfying moment came when I received a phone call from one of Karen's previous victims, the elderly man with the drought-resistant garden. He had seen the news coverage and wanted to thank me for exposing Karen's pattern of behavior. He was considering filing a malicious prosecution lawsuit against her, seeking to recover the legal fees she had cost him. "You know," he told me, "I always wondered if she had done this to other people." I felt so alone during that whole ordeal, like I was the only one who had to deal with her craziness. Knowing that she had a whole pattern of this behavior makes me feel less crazy myself. That conversation made me realize that Karen's power had always come from isolating her victims, making each of us feel like we were alone in dealing with her harassment. By bringing her pattern of behavior into the light, by connecting her victims with each other, I had broken the system she had used to terrorize her neighbors for years. The final twist came 6 months later, when a "for sale" sign appeared in Karen's front yard. According to Mrs. Rodriguez, whose husband Carlos still worked for the city planning department, Karen had decided to relocate to a different state, where she apparently planned to start fresh with her neighbor harassment hobby. Emma and I were in our backyard, our beautiful pool-free backyard with its thriving vegetable garden and new swing set, when we saw the moving truck pull up to Karen's house. Emma looked up from the tomato plant she was watering and asked, "Daddy, do you think Mrs. Mitchell will be nicer to her new neighbors?" I watched as box after box of Karen's belongings was loaded into the truck, including what